Welcome everyone to the Racontours Report. This is Taylor, and I bring back James Perloff. We've had a few interviews before talking about 9/11, talking about the 20th century, talking about COVID, talking about his recent book on miracles, missing saints, missing miracles. Today we talk about the book on Lincoln Assassination, where he goes over the quote-unquote conspiracy theories, the term that all the deep stater people love using, and the fact that this assassination has been quite ignored by the mainstream media and even the alternative media compared to, let's say, the Kennedy assassination. And oh my goodness, it's done a lot of work on, a lot of research, put a lot of time into this, as he does with all his books, of course. I definitely recommend buying it when you get the chance, and James will, of course, explain why. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, the book came out in July. It's called "Exploding the Official Myths of the Lincoln Assassination," and when I was researching the Civil War back in the 1990s, before the internet was any kind of widely used vehicle, I read many books in hard copy about the Civil War. I read Jefferson Davis's writings, I read Abraham Lincoln's writings, and read many diaries and memoirs, and it all ended up with my writing an article on the Civil War for a national magazine. But there was one book I found on a library shelf that just blew me away. It was called "Why Was Lincoln Murdered?" by Otto Eisenschimmel. It had been published in 1937, and he was an amazing researcher. I mean, he went into all the archives, the War Department archives, the archives of the Washington police at the time of the assassination. He read innumerable memoirs. I think some of those memoirs we wouldn't know about today if he hadn't discovered them, how he found them in like a rare Catholic magazine or a rare historical magazine from the 19th century. I don't know how he did it. In an era when there was no such thing as a search engine. This is back in the 1930s. Everything had to be done on paper. And he talked to people who were still living, who still had either a parent or even themselves in their old age were connected to the Lincoln assassination. And his book was amazing. It became a selection of the Book of the Month Club, which was a major deal back then. The Book of the Month Club had almost 1 million members by the 1940s. And your book had to be pretty good to get in there. And it was a well-respected tome, but it just destroyed the official narrative of the Lincoln assassination in ways that were amazing. No one had done comparable research. I don't know that anybody's ever done comparable research since then. But my article on the Civil War didn't deal with the Lincoln assassination, but the points he made, I never forgot them. You know, I thought about them from time to time, and then finally early this year, 2024, we're talking about, I said, what should I write about next? And I said, I think I should go back to Otto Eisenschimmel his book and reread it and bring his points forward to this generation, because I don't think anybody's really, not too many people are familiar with them. And I found he'd written a second book in 1940 called "In the Shadow of Lincoln's Death," which elaborated on that book. It was really good. And I was planning to write a blog post initially, not a book. And so I started reading a lot of books, more contemporary books, more modern books about the Lincoln assassination, because I wanted to see what people are saying today. And I read a lot of books, including conspiracy books. And then I read one author who just blew me away again. That was a guy named Don Thomas. And he's written books called The Reason Lincoln Had to Die and the Reason Booth Had to Die. John Wilkes Booth, of course, being the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. He's got a website called reasonlincoln.com, and he's got a YouTube channel named just Don Thomas. And after reading all his work, I got in touch with him, and he and I have become great friends since then. We've exchanged countless emails and phone calls, and he directed me to many resources I never would have known about. So many things that are available now. It used to be that if you wanted to read police files and War Department files on Lincoln assassination, you had to go to Washington, D.C. and go to the government archives on microfilm and read handwritten documents from the 1860s. Well, it turns out that thousands of those documents have now been transcribed and are available in digital format. I wouldn't have known that if you didn't tell me. And everything, the Lincoln assassination and many old memoirs from the 19th century are now available in digital format. You can word search them on archive.org. Just amazing how accelerated the process of research has been. But one thing I noticed is he never referenced Otto Eisenschimmel. So in our very first talk, I said, hey, Don, I noticed you never mentioned Eisenschimmel. Was there something that was wrong with this guy? Is something you didn't like about him? And he said, I'd never read Otto Eisenschimmel. And I was amazed because they'd both been through the government archives and they both reached the same basic conclusions independently of each other. And Eisenschimmel and Don Thomas are the two authors I want to primarily acknowledge as contributors to my work, my new book, which ties together using digitally available information as well as many books that I purchased that are not digitalized, and made this a intriguing project, especially as I found that, down south right now, they're destroying history. They are destroying Confederate monuments. In fact, in the city of Richmond, which used to be the Confederate capital, they've destroyed every statue of a Confederate that ever existed there. The last one to go was General A.P. Hill. And they're banning the Confederate flag, and they're basically erasing history. And I found that part of this modern process of erasing history has been to destroy the works of Eisenschimmel, to malign him and personally attack him in order that people will think that the South and the Confederacy was somehow the force behind the Lincoln assassination, a claim that was falsely made in 1865 when it happened. And I got pretty motivated when I saw all the lies were being told about Eisenschimmel, the false motives attributed to him. And I said, this really needs to become to the public attention. Everybody talks about, as you were saying, everybody talks about the Kennedy assassination these days, but the Lincoln assassination is on a back burner. Not many people talk about it anymore. But if you really look at it, you'll find that there was a deep state operating behind the scenes, that the feds were infiltrating the circle of John Wilkes Booth, that civil liberties were being violated just like on January the 6th. And there were secret agendas and media control, just like today. Very similar, and shows you just how long the deep state has been operating. So I felt it's time to come out with a book on the Lincoln assassination that will bring forward the discoveries that were made in the past that were once highly respected, but are now being downgraded as bizarre, ridiculous conspiracy theories. The same thing, terminology they use about Kennedy and 9/11 and other events that have occurred in more recent years.
Very well said, and absolutely, it's the deep state, new world order, whatever you want to call them. They've been using that term ever since the 1960s to discredit anyone who goes against the official narrative. And even before that, they would use other terms, like when McCarthy was doing his investigations into the communists and deep state infiltration of the government and the media. And so it just goes further back. As they say, fake news and fake history is just the fake news that has passed into the rearview mirror, unfortunately.
That's a well put phrase.
It's I didn't make that. I didn't make it up. I got it from somebody else, but I'm using it because I found it to be very good as well. And it's just
that means I can steal it from you now.
Yes, you can. Or another way to put it. Oh wait, did I? Yeah. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. But what you said is very true about the infiltration into into Booth circles as well. I mean, even during the Civil War, you had August Belmont, who came to the U.S. as a Rothschild agent in order to hijack the Democrat Party, and essentially trying to split the United States in two in order to put Rothschild-controlled banks in both sides, as they were being aided by Britain and France. And they hated Lincoln, going way back. Like if you go back to the day, British newspapers, they would always, portray Lincoln as this like hippie, or not hippie, but this this old rundown old man, like he's nothing. Always, and it's also because he was friends with the Tsar of Russia. They really hated him for that. And so it really doesn't surprise me that the Lincoln assassination has a conspiracy to it. And, there are other major conspiracies as well of assassinated figures. Like, say, for example, James Garfield, the president in 1881, was assassinated under very mysterious circumstances. And not just that, but also going further back, you have the so-called random and coincidental deaths of many U.S. presidents in the span of just a couple decades. William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, James Polk, the train derailment of Franklin Pierce, which resulted in the decapitation of his son, the National Hotel disease, which almost killed James Buchanan, but did kill his nephew, and of course the deaths of the death of Lincoln's youngest son. And people, if you look into these things, you get called a conspiracy theorist, but in reality, they're all signs of arsenal poisoning. All right, I think I said the term right, correct? Arsenic poisoning, is that the right word?
Arsenic poisoning, yeah.
Yeah, they all had very mysterious circumstances, very, very similar circumstances upon their deaths. They get the tummy ache, have bad diarrhea, they die. Same thing with Stephen Douglas, the head of the he was the one that ran against Lincoln in 1860. And he was pretty much the head of the Democrat Party at the time, the biggest Democrat in America. After the election, he became Lincoln's greatest supporter, and he was even more pro-Union than Lincoln was. On his way to Cuba, gets sick and dies. Same exact way that happened to the other people.
And then I didn't know that. Yeah. In my book, I do talk a little about Lafayette Baker, who was the head of the Secret Service, and after his break with Edwin Stanton, who we'll see as a major figure in the Lincoln assassination, he died of what his doctor thought was arsenic poisoning too. I didn't know that arsenic poisoning symptoms were related to many of these other people you mentioned, but that's quite interesting. Maybe that was the favored tool of poisoning people in the 19th century in America. I don't know, but those are interesting comments.
Yeah, because it comes down. It started all with I know this is a little off topic from the main topic, but I just want to mention this beforehand that it all goes back to Andrew Jackson when he killed the Second Central Bank, and John C. Calhoun, who was originally his vice president, who he had to take on in order to satisfy the other half of the Republican Party. He ended up he was trying to secede the South from the North by using the pretext of tariffs. And Andrew Jackson killed and when he killed the Second Central Bank, he also went down to South Carolina, told John C. Calhoun that he'll hang him if he keeps this nonsense up. And he also said in his farewell address, he said that his greatest success, his greatest achievement was killing the central bank. His second one and his greatest failure was not hanging John C. Calhoun, because Calhoun's his ideals and his propaganda would spread throughout the South and would lead to the secessionist movements, which Andrew Jackson said the original pretext was tariffs, which actually had nothing to do with tariffs. That was just the pretext. And he mentioned that the second pretext, the next one, would be about the Negro question, aka the slavery. So and all the presidents that I just mentioned, all of them were Republican. They were all, and most of them, they were all Southerners. They were all Southerners, and they who were pro-Union, and all just so happened to die under very mysterious circumstances. They all said that they want nothing to do with succeeding from the Union. All dead. But of course, you're going to kill the conspiracy theorists if you look into this and call out these quote unquote coincidences of the pattern. It's just sorry, going off topic. I just wanted to mention this because it sets a precedent for the fact that Lincoln's assassination really isn't even a surprise, considering not only how much they hated Lincoln, but how many of these other presidents have been murdered beforehand, and other major political figures. And this goes back to Europe as well, in because they were killing kings and queens and prime ministers like they were flies during the 19th century.
Yeah. My book is focused on Lincoln, and I can't comment really with any authoritativeness at all on some of these other deaths you've mentioned, but they're
Sorry.
obviously worth exploring. Sure.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention one more thing before we continue, and that's that I should have mentioned this at the start. James has also written *The Shadows of Power* in 1988, an expose on the Council on Foreign Relations. The follow-up in 2013, *Truth is a Lonely Warrior*, which goes into further details on things like climate change and the word I'm looking for. Yeah, just 9/11, etc. And they released 13 pieces of the jigsaw in 2019, which goes into even more detail on various topics, which he has written about on his website. Pearl Harbor, Lusitania, the Hindenburg incident, and many more. In 2020, he wrote his book on COVID-19 and the agendas to come, Red Pill. It was banned by Amazon a few months after he posted it, even though it was doing very well. And as I mentioned, in 2022, he released Missing Saints, Missing Miracles, talking about the miracles of past ages, and that it's possible that we could replicate them again if we prayed enough to God. Is that a good?
That's a good summary. That's a good summary. Sure. My primary focus has been geopolitics, but I've also written on creation versus evolution, to some extent, Christianity, and I view politics as part of what we call spiritual warfare. It's the forces of good versus evil, and evil has been carrying on for a long time. We see it progressively happen in America right now, with this country really going to pot in so many ways, whether it's illegal immigration, the transgender movement, the poisoning of our food, the poisoning of our water, the chemtrails, the bioweapon vaccines, the lockdowns, the threat of World War III, you name it, the Zionist movement. There's so many, we're under attack in so many ways right now. It's actually hard to keep up with, and I acknowledge that. But today we're just going to take a little break from the present and look at one pretty much broadly unresolved matter of the past, and that's the assassination of President Lincoln.
Yes. And I'm sorry I kind of derailed it a bit, but back to the Lincoln assassination. You really did a good job of linking Edwin Stanton to pretty much the main one behind the assassination, as well as the fact that many of the people connected to him just so happened to either say that they're not going to be with Lincoln on the day of the assassination, or they just so happened to get away when Stanton was was pretty much a tyrant and had no. And was known for not being nice to his subordinates that did something he didn't like.
Right, and what we can do is we could first walk through the Lincoln assassination just briefly, sort of the mainstream narrative, because I know that this event is not fresh in many people's minds. So I always think it's helpful to just refresh people's memory on what the Lincoln assassination is said to be, and then take that mainstream account and start to pick it apart piece by piece, how it's been fabricated by the mainstream historians and the lengths that they've gone to in order to discredit critics of that story.
Yep. So I guess let's start with the mainstream version of the Lincoln assassination for anyone who doesn't remember it, because most people have probably forgotten by now.
Sure. Well, of course, the Civil War took place between 1861 and 1865, and the North won. April the 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee, commander of the armies of Northern Virginia, surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, the Union commander, effectively ending the Civil War. Now, at that point, there were still some Confederate forces in the field, but this, for all practical purposes, ended the Civil War, and there was a lot of celebrating in the North. Now, 5 days later, April the 14th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd, went to a comedy at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. And General Grant was supposed to attend with the Lincolns along with his own wife, but they canceled out very late, so the Lincolns had to find a substitute. So they brought some friends of theirs, Major Henry Rathbone, who was engaged to Clara Harris, the daughter of a New York senator. They sat in the presidential box with the Lincolns. Now, at about 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth, a very famous actor in his day, and a Southern sympathizer, came into the presidential box and assassinated Lincoln with a shot to the back of the head. Now, Booth was very well known. In fact, President Lincoln had seen him perform at Ford's Theater, where he often was engaged. Now, Major Rathbone sprang to his feet and he fought with Booth, but Booth stabbed him with a Bowie knife so deeply that he broke an artery, and there was a lot of blood in the presidential box, and people thought it was from Lincoln. It was actually from Major Rathbone. Rathbone's still trying to grab him. Booth jumps onto the stage, but on his way down, he's got spurs on because he wants to make his getaway on a horse. One of his spurs caught in the American flag that was decorating the ledge, and he fell awkwardly onto the stage and he broke his leg. But still, as they say in show business, the show must go on. So he rose to his feet and he said the state motto of Virginia, sic semper tyrannis, thus always the tyrant, and the South is avenged. And he was able to make his getaway out the back door. Most of the crowd didn't understand immediately what had happened. Booth fired a shot. He timed it during a moment when the audience was roaring with laughter. He knew the play and he knew when they would be laughing. And since he often performed at Ford's Theater, some people thought he was actually part of the act. They didn't realize the president had just been shot. He was able to get away, just escaping being caught. And at the same time, this is something people will forget, there was a simultaneous assassination attempt on the Secretary of State, William Seward. Seward had been in a very serious carriage accident, was bedridden at home. One of Booth's accomplices, named Lewis Powell, entered Seward's home. He stabbed the secretary in his bed several times. The doctors thought he wouldn't live, but somehow he managed to survive. Now, in the meantime, Booth is riding south through southern Maryland with his riding companion, David Harold. But Booth's broken leg is just killing him. So they go off course several miles to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who's a country doctor that Booth slightly knows. He's met him before a couple of times. And they don't tell him that they just killed the president. They just say that Booth fell on his horse. And so Dr. Mudd reduces the fracture. He creates a crude homemade cast for the fracture because Booth says he needs to keep traveling. And Dr. Mudd had a neighbor make some crude crutches for Booth. And after resting for a few hours with that broken leg, he and Harold take off. But Booth is really slowed down by that broken leg. It's hard to walk, it's hard to ride. And then 12 days after the assassination, April the 26th, 1865, they're cornered in a barn by a Union cavalry detachment. This is the middle of the night. They set the barn on fire. Harold comes out, he surrenders, but Booth refuses to come out. And against orders, they're supposed to bring Booth back alive for trial. Against orders, one of the soldiers fires through an opening in the barn and mortally wounds Booth. He dies in 2 to 3 hours. After this, 8 alleged Booth accomplices are tried by military court. All are found guilty. 4 are hanged. The other 4 are sentenced to prison at hard labor. And this closes the account, the official account, except for one thing, which is important to know, which is that Booth originally did not plan to kill the president. His original plan had been to kidnap President Lincoln. This goes back to March the 17th, 1865. Booth and about 7 accomplices were waiting for the president's carriage on a deserted strip of road. The president was supposed to visit a place called the Soldiers' Home that day. And they had an elaborate plan to capture the president, bring his carriage south, and hold him as a hostage in return for Confederate prisoners of war. This is kind of a last-ditch stand to save the Confederacy, but it didn't work because Lincoln canceled his travel plans. And after that, Booth made a kind of absurd suggestion to his companions that they tried to kidnap the president at Ford's Theater. And 3 of his accomplices said, that's ridiculous, we'd never pull it off. And they dropped out of Booth's circle. That basically completes the mainstream narrative. But as we're going to see, there are many, many holes in this story.
Makes Makes sense. And, well, let's be honest here. What kind of mainstream story about a major historical or current event has happened where there wasn't lies being told?
Mhm.
I
It's true.
mean,
You go through all of history, almost every major event has had a official story and a backstory. The official story is given to the public through the press, and the backstory is known only to the deep state and those who participated in its orchestration.
yep, context is everything, but the mainstream only love to just give out the um, pretty much the event itself without talking. And even sometimes then they'll fabricate what they talk about the event itself. But I think even more importantly than that is that they don't ever talk about the context and the buildup that leads to the event. It's kind of like watching a movie. If you enter a movie theater in the last 20 minutes, you're not going to understand what's going on. Like maybe
Mhm.
you'll have a good time still, but you won't understand the buildup and everything. It's the same thing for history. Like take World War II for example. They'll talk about 1939 the invasion of Poland and 1941 the invasion of the Soviet Union, but they won't ever talk about the buildup to the event, what led to
Right.
all
Mhm.
this. Same thing with World War One. They won't talk about the disassembling of the three power alliance that Benjamin Disraeli was in charge of dismantling because they wanted to take over the German, Russian, and Austrian-Hungarian Empire.
Mhm.
And it just goes on and on. 9/11, COVID, etc. These things are built up years, sometimes even decades in advance, but they only ever want to give you just the last 20 minutes of that movie, not the first 2 hours that
Mhm.
build up to it.
A good comparison.
Yeah, but about the Lincoln assassination specifically, I think that the main thing that I've always wondered about the event was the idea that how could they get away with telling the story about the lone assassin? Because every time we've been told that in history, it's always not been a lone assassin. There's always been more to it than that. But I guess back then there was less ways of people finding out the truth.
Yeah, there were 8 alleged Booth accomplices tried and convicted, but yeah, he was the lone assassin of the president, and like Lee Harvey Oswald, he was killed before he could be brought to trial. But just to walk through this chronologically, the first
Wait,
question to ask. Oh, okay, go ahead.
I just want to say one more thing. Did you actually know that one of the best sources for truth and red pills back in those days actually was the New York Times? I'm not joking. This was back before it was taken over by the Rothschild Empire in 1896.
Hmm.
They were actually very studious. They did their due diligence. They were not biased, and they did their work. And they were evening. And back in those days, they were talking about secret societies. They were talking about they even outright mentioned the Rothschild family being involved in a conspiracy during the Civil War, right in the New York Times. So
Hmm.
people want to say, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist." So what about the New York Times?
Hmm.
What did they say? Well, go back and read it. You have to pay for the service, but it's right there.
Well, I knew about the takeover of the New York Times by Adolph Ochs and with J.P. Morgan money and other financial sources. I didn't really know that they were a truth-telling source prior to that, so I would need to look into that. But thanks for mentioning it.
Yep, this goes back to the guy who founded it, who was also the man who founded the Republican Party.
Hmm.
I forget his name, but yeah, oh yeah, it was it was a very truth telling magazine back then. And they were talking about the Knights of the Golden Circle. They were talking about the connections to Booth and other secret societies back in Europe. Oh my goodness, it's insane.
Hmm.
But yeah, but go ahead. Sorry, I just wanted to mention that.
Well, I thought I always think a good place to start is why it was that General Grant canceled out on going to Ford's Theater that night, and he gave Lincoln his reason as he wanted to visit his family in New Jersey. But this really didn't make sense because there was no urgency to the family visit. Nobody was about to get married or nobody was on their deathbed. He could have easily accepted the president's invitation and taken the morning train, but instead he took the night train, and he was on that train when he got the word that the president had been killed. Now, in studying the Lincoln assassination, I found that the mainstream historians who have taken over the narrative have put a spin on every aspect of the assassination. So the spin on this is that the president's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and Grant's wife, Julia Grant, didn't get along. And so Julia pressed her husband, Ulysses S. Grant, not to go to Ford's Theater. And that's the reason that they give. But this really doesn't withstand scrutiny. All the Grants have been asked to do is to sit in the presidential box in full view of the public. There's not going to be a fight between the two women. The real reason Grant didn't go is because he went to the War Department that day, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton warned Grant very seriously that it would invite disaster, that it would be extremely dangerous for him to go to Ford's Theater, so he canceled out. But this is quite in contrast to Stanton's attitude towards Abraham Lincoln. And what I'd like to do in this instance is to quote Abraham Lincoln's daytime bodyguard that day, William Crook. And here's what he wrote in his memoirs. It was about 5:30 in the afternoon. They were on the way from the White House to the War Department. Crook wrote this, quote, "I was surprised when late on the afternoon of the 14th, I accompanied Mr. Lincoln on a hurried visit to the War Department. I found that the president was more depressed than I'd ever seen him, and his step was unusually slow. Mr. Lincoln said to me, 'Crook, do you know I believe there are men who want to take my life?' Then after a pause, he said, 'I have no doubt that they will do it.' The conviction with which he spoke dismayed me. I wanted to protest, but his tone had been so calm and sure, I found myself saying instead, 'Why do you think so, Mr. President?' 'Other men have been assassinated,' was the reply. All I could say was, 'I hope you're mistaken, Mr. President.'" End quote. So it's 5:30 in the afternoon. Crook stands outside the War Department while Lincoln goes in. Now, Lincoln wanted a reliable escort, a strong escort to go with him to Ford's Theater. He goes to the War Department, speaks to Stanton. Stanton does tell him not to go to Ford's Theater, but not with the same urgency and conviction he told Grant. Lincoln said to Stanton, "I want a reliable bodyguard. I want your assistant, Major Eckert, to accompany me. I've seen how strong he is. I've seen him break iron pokers off over his arm, several in a row." And Stanton says, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, we're going to be very busy here in the War Department tonight. I can't possibly spare Major Eckert." Well, Lincoln didn't accept this. Lincoln went straight to Major Eckert, who was in charge of the telegraph desk, the cipher desk. And he said, "Major Eckert, I know how strong you are. Would you please accompany me tonight to Ford's Theater?" Eckert says, "Sorry, Mr. President, I got too much work to do." So Lincoln says, "Well, surely, Major Eckert, your work could wait for the morning." And Eckert says, "No, sir, got to be done tonight." Now, there's two things about this. Besides the fact, where did this information come from? It comes from Eckert's own assistant, David Homer Bates, in his memoirs. First thing to know is that it's extremely unorthodox and unusual for a major in the United States Army to refuse a request from his commander-in-chief, the President of the United States. Very unusual. But the most important thing to know is that Eckert and Stanton were lying to Lincoln. They were not busy with work in the War Department. They were not even in the War Department. Eckert signed off the desk to Homer Bates, and Stanton wasn't even in the War Department. He went home, had dinner. He remained at home until the news of the president's assassination arrived. So they were not in the War Department. Now, the mainstream historians always have their spin. So the spin is this. Well, Stanton and Eckert were so concerned for the president's life, they thought that if they lied to him and said that Eckert couldn't be spared as his bodyguard, that Lincoln would change his mind. That is false, because Lincoln said right then and there, "I'm still going to Ford's Theater. The people expect me. It's been announced. Major Eckert, if you can't go with me, I'll take Major Rathbone, but I'd much rather have you because I know how strong you are." So this is a lie. They're lying to Lincoln. If they were really concerned about the president's safety, they would have said, "You know, on second thought, Mr. President, you can have Major Eckert after all. We'll give him to you. We'll figure a way to deal with our busyness in the War Department." So the question becomes, who was Lincoln's bodyguard that night? This is where it really gets interesting. His bodyguard, I call this in my book, worst bodyguard ever. His bodyguard is John F. Parker, who's a member of the Metropolitan Washington Police. Now, John F. Parker had been charged with misconduct many times for visiting a whorehouse, for using foul language, being drunk on duty, falling asleep on duty, but always for some reason the charges were dismissed, and somehow he gets assigned to the presidential bodyguard detail.
Of
Now,
course. I just want to say, because of course, because just like in 9/11, the people who so-called who were supposedly incompetent and made mistakes all got promoted instead of
oh
demoted.
yeah, yeah, nobody got punished for 9/11. Almost, like you say, almost all of them got promoted, even though they had failed to intercept the attack.
Yes.
Well, John F. Parker was supposed to guard the president. He was supposed to sit outside the presidential box at Ford's Theater, but he left his post and he went next door to a place called the Star Saloon and began to booze it up. And he was not seen again until 6 o'clock the following morning. He was not at his post when Lincoln was killed. He showed up at 6 o'clock the following morning at a police station in Washington with a hooker, and he charged her with being a lady of the streets. Now, she was not charged. The police were like, "Are you kidding? We're after the president's assassins. We don't care about some hooker." And some people think that John F. Parker actually spent the night with that prostitute, and there's reasons to believe that. Number one, he was known to frequent whorehouses. Number two, the streets of Washington were in pandemonium after the assassination. People were threatening to forming a lynch mob. They were threatening to burn down Ford's Theater. It was a very violent time, not the time a prostitute would be out plying her trade. Also, he brought her in at 6 o'clock in the morning, which suggested that he nabbed her maybe between 5:30 and 6. No, what hooker is that at that time looking for a customer? But anyway, you would think that Parker would have been punished for deserting his post and letting the president be killed, and certainly would have lost his job. And I just want to read you what William Crook said. Now, William Crook, the daytime bodyguard, was the bodyguard for 5 different presidents. He knew what he was talking about. He said that Crook should have been at the rear of the president's box, quote, fully armed, and to permit no unauthorized person to pass. Incredible as it may seem, he quietly deserted his post of duty. It's through this guard's amazing recklessness, to use no stronger words, that Booth accomplished his foul deed, end quote. But Parker's not punished. He doesn't go to jail. He doesn't lose his job. And he actually remains on the presidential bodyguard detail after leaving his post and letting President Lincoln be killed.
Of course.
Yeah. Now, the Washington police did investigate Parker. They held a hearing. But guess what? All the records of that hearing have disappeared. He was let off the hook. And so we have no record as to what was decided at that time. And if you study the Lincoln assassination, you'll find that many vital papers have vanished from the records, his being one of them. Now, who took charge of Lincoln's, the investigation of Lincoln's assassination? It was Stanton, the same guy who denied Lincoln the protection he wanted at Ford's Theater. He now puts himself in charge of the murder investigation. Now, this should have fallen under the jurisdiction of the Attorney General. After all, John Wilkes Booth was a civilian, the president was a civilian, and Ford's Theater was a civilian environment. It's not a War Department matter, but Edwin Stanton, falsely claimed that this was a Confederate act of war. Therefore, it falls under the War Department. Therefore, I'm taking charge. And a very a feared man, nobody challenged him, and he just took charge of the investigation. Now, he was a ruthless man. He sent countless Union soldiers to firing squads to be killed for falling asleep on duty. He was not an old softy, but somehow when it comes to John F. Parker, the bodyguard, he's an old softy. Fine, he let the president be killed. We're not going to do anything to this man. Now, just for contrast, I want to tell you what happened to an employee at Ford's Theater named Ned Spangler. Ned Spangler was a carpenter and scene shifter, and that meant that while the curtain was down between acts, he would shift the scenery for the next act or the next scene. And what was his crime? He was one of the big 8 that were charged in the Lincoln conspiracy trial. His crime was this. John Wilkes Booth came riding up to the back of the theater on a rented horse. It was not a horse that he owned. And the stable owner, named John Pumphrey, had warned Booth, said, "Mr. Booth, watch out. This horse is very high-spirited. He could break away from you." Now, Booth didn't want that to happen. He wanted that horse to be ready and waiting for him when he ran out of Ford's Theater after killing the president. and he wasn't going to have time to untie the horse. So he wanted someone to hold the horse. So he called to Ned Spangler. Now he knew Spangler, but not as a co-conspirator. Spangler simply knew Booth because they both often worked at both worked at Ford's Theater. I mean, he knew him on a professional basis. John Wilkes Booth had performed there for years. Spangler had worked there for years, and Booth said, "Hey, Spangler, would you hold this horse for me? I got to go into the theater for a couple minutes." Well, Spangler's holding the horse, and time's a wasting. He's got to get back inside to start moving scenery. So he hands off the horse to another employee named Joseph Burroughs. Hey, Joseph, would you hold this horse, Mr. Booth? I got to go back inside the theater. That's it. That's the extent of his crime. He didn't know that Booth was going in there to shoot the president. There's no proof whatsoever in existence that he ever discussed killing the president with Booth, or that he knew any of Booth's other accomplices. He did not attempt to hide himself after the assassination. He knew nothing about it. But Stanton orders him to be arrested, and he's placed in solitary confinement. His hands are handcuffed at all times. His legs are shackled with an 8-inch chain for weeks on end, and he has to wear a canvas hood over his head. Now, he can't see, he can barely hear, has one small hole for breathing and eating, and you can see a picture of it in my book, but you can also see it online very easily. And this is true for all the other 8 accused, except for Mary Surratt, the one woman. She was manacled, but she didn't have to wear the canvas hood, which, by the way, was invented by Edwin Stanton as a form of punishment. They had to wear these hoods for months, and even when mealtime came, the hoods couldn't come off. And it was impossible for Spangler to feed himself because he couldn't see the food. He was handcuffed. So the guards, who were forbidden to speak to him, they took pity on him, and one guard would stand watch and the other would feed him out of pity.
I just want to say, how do they expect these people to eat if they can't move their arms or their legs, and they can barely do anything? Like, it seems like they were almost expecting the guards to do that to a certain extent, because how else are the people going to survive?
Right. It was ridiculous, and it's a violation of the 8th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, which forbids cruel and unusual punishment. This was certainly followed that category. Actually, the doctor who was in charge of these prisoners went to Stanton and said, these people are going to go crazy. If you've ever seen studies done of soldiers who underwent sensory deprivation tests, not being able to speak or hear or see for weeks on end will drive a person crazy. But Stanton let it go on, and he would not heed the doctor's advice to take those canvas hoods off their heads.
I just want to say one thing. Cruel, unusual punishment. It fits these guys to a T. I mean, look at what Eisenhower did to the Germans after World War II and the Rhine.
Yeah, sure. The camps that Eisenhower set up, where hundreds of thousands of German soldiers died, and he not to go off topic, but he declassified them as prisoners of war and said they were DEF, disarmed enemy forces. And therefore, he said, I don't have to abide by the Geneva Convention because these are not POWs technically, because I've changed the terminology. And hundreds of thousands of people, they had no shelter, no latrines, no food, and hundreds of thousands died, in their own filth after the war. And they talk about how bad the Germans were to prisoners. If you want to contrast, watch an old movie called Stalag 17. It won an Academy Award. It was starring with a star called William Holden. And that movie was actually written by 2 men who had been prisoners in a German POW camp. And you'll see that in the German POW camps, they had shelters. Each man had a bunk. Each man had a blanket. They had a stove. They got 3 meals a day. It wasn't food from the Ritz, but the Germans conformed to the Geneva Convention. Eisenhower did not. But anyway, I don't want to go too far off the topic.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up as a way of basically showing some precedent that these people, these sick individuals, they are filled with hatred and evil. And
yes, Stanton was a psychopath. He was. Yeah. He really was. Yeah.
They do anything to people that they don't like in order to torture them, or the same thing they did after 9/11 to force confessions out of these
right.
people they say
Guantanamo. Yeah. Right.
Absolutely.
Sometimes confessing to crimes they couldn't have even possibly commit because the building they were supposedly going to bomb hadn't even been built yet.
Yep, same thing in Nuremberg.
Ridiculous stuff. But the fate of Mr. Spangler he finally went on trial, but he didn't even get a defense attorney until after the trial began. And he was sentenced to 6 years at hard labor, but that was the lightest sentence that anyone got. 4 of the others were hanged. The other 3, including Dr. Mudd, was sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor for making a cast for Booth's leg. But
Wow.
Spangler got off with 6 years at hard labor for holding Booth's horse briefly. And he wasn't even holding it when Booth came out. It was another employee, but he still was whacked by Stanton. And you'll find throughout the Lincoln assassination annals that this holds true. People who are guilty as heck get completely off the hook, but people who have nothing to do with the assassination are ruthlessly punished by Stanton. This happens again and again.
Yeah, we got to have the fall guys because the public's angry. They
right, sure.
They use anger as justification for the torture, even though it's obviously not justified. But they want to make people emotionally satisfied because it's like, oh, these guys are in on it. Look at what we're doing to them. We're serving justice.
Right. Yeah, the public gets very outraged. I know after 9/11, I knew a young cop who wanted to enlist, and I had to explain to his mother about all the false flags that brought us into wars, and she understood, and she talked her son out of it, you know. But they do use these events to emotionally trigger people to get them to go to war not for our country's defense, but for the defense of Greater Israel, things like that. But another thing to know is John Wilkes Booth, when he went into the presidential box, was armed with 2 weapons, a single-shot Derringer and a knife. And so the question I have to ask is, how is Booth so confident he only needs 1 bullet to get rid of the president? I mean, if there had been a competent bodyguard at the post, such as William Crook, all of Lincoln's bodyguards had 38 Colt revolvers. What if he had to use that 1 bullet to get rid of the bodyguard? And now he's going to have to take out Lincoln with a knife. But to get to Lincoln, he'll have to go through Major Rathbone first. By the time he gets to Lincoln, Lincoln's a strong man. He's going to be on his feet at that point. 6'4". Lincoln was a strong man. He used to be a rail splitter in his youth. Booth is only 5'8". He's going to have an easy time stabbing Lincoln to death. But by that time, there would have been people rushing into the presidential box to rescue the president anyway. So what I would like to suggest is that the reason, besides the modifications to the presidential box, which I won't get into here, that Booth was confident he would need only 1 bullet, is he'd already been told, "Don't worry, there won't be a bodyguard at the president's box. You're going to be given free admission into that box." And as proof, I'm going to prove to you that Booth had inside information. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to ask one question. I know this is not entirely relevant, but I wanted to ask, what is rail splitting?
It's hammering nails on a rail, the rails on a railroad. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, wow. Yeah, he must have been a strong person to be able to do that. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I hope I've got that right, because I haven't thought about the definition of rail splitting, but I think that's what it was for. But we're talking about breaking iron rails with an axe or a hammer. So he was certainly a strong man.
Yes.
Nobody doubted that Lincoln was a strong man. And even in the kidnapping plot that I mentioned earlier, they had an extremely strong accomplice to try to overwhelm Lincoln in his carriage because they knew how strong a man he was. I was going to say, I'm going to prove to you that John Wilkes Booth had inside information. His accomplice, Lewis Powell, who attempted to kill Secretary of State Seward. How did he get into Seward's home? Well, he went there as a pharmacy delivery boy. He had a little package with a bottle inside. He said, "I've come here with medicine ordered by Dr. Verity." That was Seward's physician. Now, the servant said, "Well, I'll take the medicine up." And Powell said, no, I'm supposed to deliver this in person. Now, he brushed the servant aside. He knew exactly where the stairs were. He knew exactly where Seward's bedroom was on the 3rd floor. How do you know the doctor's name and where Seward's bedroom is located? This is inside information. Booth has got that information either from inside the government or inside the Seward home, but he definitely has inside information that's facilitating these murder attempts. He's been tipped off. This is not just something that he's concocted on his own. And there's another important point that mainstream historians will not look at, just like they don't ask why did Booth know he only needed one bullet. This is what I call Booth's weird target selection. Now, this requires a little elaboration, but after the war, the South was ruthlessly exploited economically, called Reconstruction is what they called it. The South had already been destroyed by the war. They were the ones who were normally being invaded. Gettysburg would be an exception, but Atlanta was burned to the ground, Savannah was burned to the ground, Richmond was destroyed. Crops that were not burned were stolen, and people were impoverished. But after the war, they were exploited. They had to help pay the North's war debt. They had to help pay the pensions of Union soldiers, so like Germany had to pay the pensions of Allied soldiers after World War I. It was terrible. People were starving down there. You might remember, if you ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, the old movie Gone with the Wind. Ever seen that?
Actually, I'm going to be honest. I have not seen it. I tried looking.
Oh, okay.
I have not.
I won't get into that, but it talks about these things. You know, the heroine, Scarlett O'Hara, goes back to her home and there's nothing to eat except some radishes in the ground, and people were having onerous taxes put on their homes, so they lost their homes. They called them carpetbaggers. Northerns would come down, take over their businesses and homes because they couldn't pay the taxes on them. 2 billion bales of cotton were confiscated, and the people weren't allowed to vote for their own leaders down south for 12 years under military occupation. The war lasted 4 years, but the Reconstruction occupation lasted for 12 until 1877. And instead of having their own elected governors, people were ruled by military governors, officers appointed by the War Department. And this is one reason why Southerners were very bitter towards Yankees for a long time after the war. Now, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to mention that. And this even goes into World War I, when they had to unify the North and the South to fight for the same cause. But they were putting out propaganda, basically showing that we're all one and the same, which is nice and all. But the purpose they're doing that is because they want to unify both parts of the country to fight together against the Germans and the Austrians in World War I.
That's a great point, and it's one that I've often. I have discussed before, Gone with the Wind, which basically honored the South, very unusual trend for Hollywood, right? Came out in 1939, the same year that World War II began. Why? They wanted Southerners to start feeling, all's forgiven. We recognize you people suffered, and we want to make you feel good because we're about to put you together with the Yankees to fight the Germans. And the same thing happened at the beginning of World War I. I don't know if you've ever heard of this movie, the movie called Birth of a Nation. Totally pro-Confederate. That came out in 1913. Again, making Southerners feel great. Why? Because we want you to fight with Yankees against Germans. Yep. Same old story. Hollywood knows how to build up the public, and they've done this many, many, many times. Look at the Oscar winners and get an idea of why they're getting Oscars, for the most part. Anyway, Lincoln's death was not celebrated in the South. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, said, quote, "It will be disastrous for our people." Robert E. Lee condemned it. Virginia newspapers called Booth a scoundrel. And back in the 90s, I had to go back and check this, but I'd read a long diary by Sarah Morgan Dawson, who lived in Louisiana during the Civil War. And the very last words of her 440-page diary are this: "Our Confederacy is gone with one shot, the report of the pistol fired at Lincoln." Down south, everybody knew that because the South was going to be blamed for the death of Lincoln, Reconstruction was going to be much harder. And this is something that I didn't mention, but is really important to understand. Lincoln was against the Reconstruction plan. He wanted a restored Union. He wanted people to keep their property down south. He wanted voting rights restored. And he wanted the southern states restored to the Congress, which was bitterly opposed by what they call the radical Republicans of his own party, because they said, if the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats get together in Congress, we'll be outvoted. And we in the deep state who we represent, we're going to be nullified. So Lincoln was standing in the way of this, and there was just one important person in his administration who agreed with Lincoln. I'm sorry, I'll just finish this and I'll throw it back to you. Seward, Secretary of State Seward, stood with Lincoln. We should have a gentle reconciliation with the South. These are the only two people that were attacked, the people who did not want to brutally attack the South with Reconstruction. Isn't it interesting that all throughout the South, people knew this was the Lincoln assassination was a disaster, but John Wilkes Booth somehow does not know that what he's doing is going to destroy the South and not help it.
Exactly. I just wanted to say, and ironically, interestingly enough, many of these radical Republicans just so happen to have ties back to Europe, specifically the Rothschild banking dynasty. It's really interesting because as I said before with Lincoln, they hated Lincoln. For as you mentioned too, he wanted to preserve the Union, also because he wanted to issue the greenbacks, and also he issued the greenbacks, and also because he was friends with the Tsar, who helped keep Britain and France from overtly getting involved in the Civil War. So, right. So the Lincoln, although nonetheless, many of the agents were in both the North and the South, and were instigating things on both sides. Which really goes to show why exactly the Reconstruction. It's one of the big reasons as to why the Reconstruction period was so terrible. They wanted to demoralize the country.
Right. Conquer and divide. There is a quote that it's a question. This is Donald Jeffries' book, Crimes and Cover-Ups. He has a quote, and I saw this quote a long time ago. It supposedly was in the London Times from banker Lord Goshen. Say, quote, if this, I'm talking about the greenbacks, right? If this mischief financial policy, which has its origin in North America, should become indurated down to a fixture, then the government will furnish its own money without cost, will pay off debts and be without debt, for all the money necessary to carry on its own commerce, will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed. It will destroy every monarchy on the globe. End quote. I don't know if it's an alleged quote. I don't know if it's true or not. But the thing about greenbacks was it was essentially constitutional money was issued by the government, and there was no debt attached. Now, the Federal Reserve notes of today, the Fed meets the national debt, but it does so by exchanging the money it creates for nothing for bonds, which is sold at interest. So every time they create more money, it's at interest. The greenbacks did cause inflation. There was inflation during the Civil War, but there was no debt attached. So some people think that Lincoln was assassinated as revenge for the greenbacks. I'm not quite sure if that's true, and so I don't go into my book. The greenbacks still gave the war profiteers kind of unlimited access to government funds, and I don't know that they would have killed Lincoln after the war simply out of vengeance. I think it was more to prevent a gentle reconciliation and to replace it with a brutal economic exploitation of the South through Reconstruction.
Makes sense, yeah. It's it makes sense. It's like what a lot of people talk about with Kennedy. It's like there's multiple things that go into it, not just one. Although I will say that one thing about Kennedy, and I'll just mention this because I don't want to just one thing because I don't want to get too far off track. He wasn't actually trying to take down the Federal Reserve. Kennedy.
Right. That's true. I never heard that he was. And I think that J.Ed Griffin, who's as authoritative as anyone, has affirmed that.
Yeah. But about Lincoln, his death really caused a lot of bad things to happen to the country. Not just the Reconstruction period, but going on to after this. You get into the 1880s and the 1890s, and this is when all of the all of these immigrants from Eastern Europe start coming in. They had strong immigration laws back then, but they lessened them up, particularly under the administration of Grover Cleveland. Jacob Schiff asked him to lessen the restrictions so that more Jewish individuals and from Europe would come in, and if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated and the South had gotten a proper Reconstruction, this probably wouldn't have happened. Because
Good point. Yeah.
But sorry, I didn't mean to go too far off topic.
Well, no, that's not off topic at all. Well, I could talk about how the radical Republicans celebrating after Lincoln's death, but I think we'll go into more of the forensics of the assassination. Now, right after the assassination, the telegraph wires went down, and here's quoting the May 2nd New York World, quote, within 15 minutes after the murder, May 2nd, 1865. Within 15 minutes after the murder, the wires were severed entirely around the city, excepting only a secret wire for government uses. Now, this is interesting. Guess who's in charge of the telegraph system at that time?
I believe it was the bodyguard that refused Lincoln's invitation.
Right. Thomas Eckert, who said, I can't be your bodyguard tonight. He's in charge of the telegraph wires when they go down. Now, there's some interesting quotes. 2 years later, it's questioned by the House Judiciary Committee. So I just want to report what was said between the congressman and Eckert. Quote, did you have knowledge of the telegraph wires at about the time of the assassination of President Lincoln? I did. Was there any interruption of the lines that night? There was. What was it? It was my impression that they were cut, but we got circuit again very early the next morning. The manager of the commercial office reported the cause of crossing of wires in the main batteries. Throwing a ground wire over the main wires would have caused the same trouble, and taking it off would have put it in ordinary working condition. I just want to, as an aside, I want to say that John Wilkes Booth wouldn't have known how to do this, but obviously Eckert did. Continuing, was there an investigation of what the real cause of the difficulty was? No, sir. It did not seem to be sufficiently important, as the interruption only continued about 2 hours. I was so full of business of every character, I could not give up my personal attention, end quote. So a couple of things about this. He says it wasn't important. Well, it was very important to John Wilkes Booth because it meant he had a 2-hour head start before they could use the telegraph wires to communicate that the president had just been assassinated. Very important. And how does he know it's only going to last 2 hours? You know, it could have lasted 6 or 8. He should have looked into it immediately. This is his job. This is his business. The other thing is he says he couldn't look into the telegraph wire disruption because he was too busy. Where did we hear that before? The night before, he told Lincoln, I can't be your bodyguard. I'm too busy. So, and you'll find that this continues with Eckert. And if you want to know what happened to Thomas Eckert, they say loyalty pays off, right? In 1866, Stanton made Eckert his assistant secretary of war. And after he leaves the government, he goes to work for the robber baron Jay Gould. And then he gets elevated in the telegraph industry and becomes president and chairman of Western Union. Now, you're not, in the real world, you don't get to be president and chairman of Western Union, which, by the way, is the most powerful telecommunication system in the world at that time, like being like in charge of Microsoft or Google today, right? You get to be president and chairman of Western Union. You have to have very powerful people in back of you. You don't get there just because you're a hardworking lad. Now, but there's so much more. Booth escaped from Washington, D.C. Now, Booth, to get south, he has to cross over a bridge, and the bridge he's using is called the Navy Yard Bridge. He wants to cross out of Washington, D.C. into southern Maryland, but there's a curfew in effect, a strict curfew, and let me read the exact orders in effect. Quote, no person except general officers will be passed over any of the several crossings between the hours of 9 p.m. and daylight without the countersign, meaning a password, and a pass, end quote. Well, Booth gets across that bridge somehow. He had to know there was a curfew in effect. The curfew has been in effect for 2.5 years, almost 2.5 years. Booth often spends time in Washington. He can't not know that Washington has a 9 o'clock curfew. Yet somehow he and his writing companion, who comes up separately, David Harold, both get across the bridge. Now, we have no information about how they got across the bridge except for the man in charge of the bridge, Sergeant Silas Cobb. Now, Booth, of course, was killed. Harold was hanged, so we have to rely on Sergeant Cobb. What Sergeant Cobb said was that Booth came riding up about 10:25 p.m., which is about right. This is 10 minutes after the assassination. Cobb says, sorry, sir, no one can cross after 9 p.m. Booth says, well, I live in Maryland. I didn't know there was a rule like that. So Cobb says, according to his own statement, what are you doing out so late? And I'm doing some noises. I don't know if it's coming from me or from you. I'm hearing some.
It might be me. I live near a street, so should I mute my microphone?
No, that's okay. That's okay. I have that kind of thing happen too. Sometimes the grass we mow it outside while I'm doing in the middle of an interview.
Oh my, that's the worst.
That happens. You know, it happens.
That is the worst.
But I was talking about Booth crossing over the bridge. He must get across this bridge because all throughout Washington. The word is spreading like wildfire that John Wilkes Booth has assassinated President Lincoln. Everybody knows that it's Booth. He's done it in front of more than 1,500 witnesses. He's a very recognizable, identifiable figure. So Booth says, I have to get home. I didn't know about the rules. So Sergeant Cobb says he lets him pass. Then Booth's writing companion, David Harold, comes up, and Booth really needs Harold because Harold knows the roads of Southern Maryland very well. So Sergeant Cobb says, sorry, kid. He's only 22 years old, Harold. Sorry, kid, nobody can cross after 9 o'clock. Harold says, well, I really need to get home. I live in Maryland. So Cobb says, what are you doing out so late, kid? So Harold says, well, you know how it is. So I had a tryst with a young lady, but I need to get home. So Cobb says, okay, kid, you can go. So two things about this. These guys have to get across the bridge. They have to have a guarantee. Booth cannot be planning to just smooth talk his way across that bridge. He has to have a guarantee he's going to get across that bridge, because if he doesn't, he's going to be lynched in Washington before the police can even get him. Secondly, why wasn't Sergeant Cobb punished? He just let the president's assassins escape Washington, D.C. in violation of standing military orders. You'd think he would have been court-martialed. His sergeant's stripes ripped off his uniform, but instead, just like John F. Parker, the bodyguard, Stanton lets him off the hook. No punishment whatsoever for Sergeant Cobb.
Do you think he was in on the plot, or do you think he just so happened to do something that benefited Stanton?
It could be the way he said, or it could be that he was tipped off in advance to let these men pass, or it could be that Booth and Harold were given this countersign, the password and passes, to get across the bridge. That would have enabled them to get across too. I don't know which scenario it was, but I do know that the story, official story, is very suspect. But the mainstream historians will never question it. You can be sure. They'll accept everything as given.
Of course.
So another question is, and that's the fact that the escape route that Booth and Harold took is the only road that Stanton, who's now in charge of the murder investigation, leaves unpatrolled. I'm going to quote Eisenschimmel's book from 1937. This is a copy of it, but of course it's not the original 1937. It's just a reprint. Otto Eisenschimmel wrote this in 1937. Quote, only one hole was left in the network that Stanton spun around Washington. This was the road that pointed straight south from Washington to Port Tobacco. It's the road Booth was most likely to use for it led to the Confederacy, the only place where the assassin could hope to find protection. And all the wires sent out from the War Department on the night of April the 14th, this route was not mentioned once, and no precautions were taken to guard it. The only road that Stanton failed to bar was the one by which Booth escaped from Washington, and there never should have been the slightest doubt he would use it, end quote. Now I'm going to confirm that. I'm going to confirm that Stanton should have known that Booth was going to use this road. Now, just like in January the 6th, feds penetrated Booth's circle. One of these feds was named Louis Weichman. Weichman knew all about the kidnapping plot. He was working in the War Department while simultaneously living in Mary Surratt's boarding house, where meetings were sometimes held about the kidnapping of President Lincoln. So Weichman was reporting everything about the kidnapping plot to his superior, Captain Daniel Gleason. According to Gleason, all this information went to Stanton. We have no documents from Stanton. He burned his paper trail, but he should have known. He should have known. And Captain Gleason himself, as soon as he heard about the assassination, went straight to the War Department. He said, give me a squad of soldiers. I know what road they're taking. They're taking the same road they're going to use for the kidnapping. They're going down to Surrattsville. Give me a squad of soldiers. I'll go in pursuit of them. He was told, stay where you are, Captain Gleason. You'll be more help to us here in Washington. But Stanton had to know this is the road that Booth is going to take. He's already been fully informed of Booth's plan for the kidnapping. So I'm going to talk about the capture, or rather the assassination of Booth. But before we do that, I'll throw it back to you.
Well, first of all, if you ever feel the need to take a quick break for something, just let me know, because we can always just pause the recording and just return. Mm-hmm. But I also wanted to say that there's a lot of parallels with this event to to other big events as well. Like say like 9/11. All these people who were told to stand down or were incompetent, instead of getting demoted, they get promoted. Just like Ecker did. It's just it's crazy. It's like you're like you said, loyalty pays off. You do what you're asked, and you get from right to the top. This happens throughout all of history. When people link to the deep state, they start off on the bottom. Eisenhower, for example, he started off as just some nobody that almost got kicked out of West Point, and then but then he ended up becoming friends with Bernard Baruch, and then by the 30s he's having golf trips with him, and then by the 40s by Pearl Harbor, he's being groomed in order to become head of the Allied forces. And
then president.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, and there's this interesting picture of Eisenhower with Churchill, both sitting. This is when Churchill's in his second term as prime minister, and when Eisenhower's president. So in 1953 or 54, Eisenhower's on the left, Churchill's on the right, and in the middle is big Bernard Baruch.
He's about 2 feet higher than they are where he's sitting. Yeah, Bernard Baruch through Woodrow Wilson, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He's always seems like he's the commander in chief. That picture clearly states for all to see his superiority over Churchill and Eisenhower.
Yep, he owned both of them, and he owned Pershing of World War I. He owned Harry Truman because he bailed him out in the early 40s when he was running for the Congress or the Senate, I forget. But he owned all these people. It's just you can't write a story on American history without mentioning this man, or at least a truthful account of it. But I just wanted to mention this because this goes out all throughout history. You do what you're asked, you get promoted right to the top. Right.
Well, why don't we take a 3 or 4 minute break at this point? I think it'd be a good idea. I'll just stretch my legs and we can resume in about 3 or 4 minutes. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. Here once again with James Perloff, writer of many books. We're talking about his book on the Lincoln Assassination, and we've been discussing the many anomalies with the official story, as well as how many people seem to either make false excuses, lying to the president. They seem to just let John Wilkes Booth go, or they just so happen to fail in their duties and still get promoted. It's a wonder how the world works like that.
Yeah, I guess it's not much of a wonder to the deep state. For example, Edwin Stanton has been complimented about how cool and calm and collected he was after Lincoln's assassination when everybody else was losing their heads. Well, allow me to suggest the reason he was cool, calm, and collected was that he already knew everything that was about to happen, and it was part of his own plan. So, of course, he was not surprised, as the rest of the people surrounding him were, with occasional exceptions like Major Eckert, at what happened. I wanted to talk about the confrontation with Booth at the barn in Virginia. It gets pretty interesting down there. Booth is killed there, and there are many soldiers and detectives, thousands of them in Virginia. Any one of them could have captured Booth. And there was a Colonel James O'Beirne, actually a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient for valor during the Civil War. He was on Booth's trail and reported to Washington he was very close to getting Booth, but he was told to stay where he was. And instead, a select detachment at the cost of an extra day's time was sent from Washington with trusted associates of Stanton. Let me talk about this. A detachment, it was 26 enlisted men, some say 25, under the normal command of Lieutenant Edward Doherty. However, 2 special men were attached to it. One was Luther Baker, the cousin of Lafayette Baker, the head of the Secret Service. The other was Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger, who was also part of the Secret Service. Now, although he was not on active duty, Lieutenant Colonel Conger had the highest rank. He was nominally in command of the detachment. Now, the detachment was supposed to bring back Booth alive, but he was killed against orders. Now, some of your viewers might be wondering, why would they let Booth escape and also kill him? That seems contradictory. And I believe that the answer to that is Booth's broken leg. It was the one thing in this whole thing that nobody foresaw. Booth and Stanton did not foresee the broken leg that slowed Booth down to a snail's pace. and it basically made it inevitable that he would be captured and inevitable that he had to be executed. I want to talk a little about what happened at what they call the Garrett Farms, owned by Richard Garrett in Virginia. Booth and his writing companion David Harold were cornered in a barn there in the middle of the night by this Union detachment, a special Union detachment that had been sent down by Stanton. And again, a soldier, his name was Boston Corbett, fired through an opening in the barn, killing Booth against orders. Now, a few things to note about this. Harold surrendered. Actually, he surrendered before they set the barn on fire. So now Booth is outnumbered 29-1. And you have to wonder why the Union soldiers are so terrified of this man in the barn with a broken leg. He's in great pain, but they're so timid and so terrified, they don't dare rush in there and just take Booth alive, which is what it's supposed to do. Why are they so, if you look at the Civil War, I'm sure you've heard of Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg. There were other battles, like you won't be familiar probably with some of these, but Cold Harbor and Fredericksburg and Franklin, where Confederate and Union soldiers marched to almost certain death. And yet these 29 veteran Civil War soldiers are terrified to come into the barn and get Booth. Now granted, he's armed. He could have gotten a couple of shots off before they grabbed him, but it's dark in the middle of the night in that barn, and he's not going to, be able to take very good aim, especially in his pain. But they decide to go after him. And I want to say a couple things about Sergeant Boston Corbett. He said he shot Booth, but you know what? There wasn't a single soldier in that detachment that saw him do it. And everybody who heard that shot confirmed that it was a pistol shot, not a rifle shot that got Booth. And that was confirmed in the autopsy that was subsequently performed. Now, one thing I want to mention is that 100 years after the assassination in 1965, this magazine, the Album of the Lincoln Murder, did an investigation and found that Sergeant Boston Corbett didn't have a pistol. He only had a carbine or short rifle. So if that's true, he couldn't have fired that shot. And again, nobody confirmed that he saw it. Now, I want to quote what Lieutenant Luther Baker said before the House Judiciary Committee 2 years later. Quote, I supposed at the time that Conger, who's the commander of the detachment, supposed at the time that Conger shot him. And I said, what on earth did you shoot him for? Said he, I did not shoot him. And the idea flashed on my mind, if he did, it had better not be known. Now, it's Conger who has the idea and who lights up the barn. And by lighting up, what he did, he took a flaming, he put shreds of hay on fire, threw them into the barn. This lit up the barn inside and made Booth a perfect target. It's dark outside. It's flaming bright inside the barn. Booth is now a perfect target. He's walking on a crutch. And according to R.B. Garrett, the son of the farm's owner, and Lieutenant Baker, who could see Booth, he was slowly walking on a crutch towards the front door. He was not threatening anyone, but there was a pistol shot and Booth fell to the ground. And again, Conyers thought that it was, Luther Baker thought it was Lieutenant Colonel Conger that actually shot him. Now, the credit was given to Sergeant Boston Corbett. Again, he did not have a pistol, according to Civil War Times Illustrated. But he was supposed to be court-martialed for disobeying orders. It's supposed to bring Booth back alive. So he went back to Washington. And guess what Stanton does? Stanton makes this announcement, quote, the rebel, meaning John Wilkes Booth, is dead. The patriot, meaning Sergeant Corbett, lives. He has saved us continued excitement, delay, and expense. The patriot is released, end quote. So Stanton canceled the court-martial. Now, if there'd been a court-martial, there would have been witnesses called. Men from the detachment would have been asked to state what they saw. There would have been defense counsel, prosecution, and the weapon that killed Booth would have had to been produced. But Stanton, by canceling the court-martial, prevented any of that from happening. Just as he let the president's bodyguard off the hook, just as he let Sergeant Boston Corbett, who let Booth cross the bridge, off the hook. Now he lets Sergeant Boston Corbett off the hook. There's no investigation of what really took place at the Garrett farm.
I just want to say that reminds me of what happened after Pearl Harbor. How they how Husband Kimmel and Short were they wanted to be court-martialed,
Right,
but
correct.
they were denied by Roosevelt.
That's right. They wanted court-martial because Roosevelt had appointed a special commission called the Roberts Commission, which consisted of his own cronies, who found that all blame for Pearl Harbor laid not with Washington, which had put the fleet in Pearl Harbor against all naval advice in the first place, was at fault, and all the blame was in our commanders at Pearl Harbor. And there's so much more that can be said about that. I would refer your viewers to my book. I don't know if I've got it in reach here or not.
13 pieces.
13 Pieces of the Jigsaw has a full chapter on Pearl Harbor, or you can read it for free if you want to read it in hard copy on my website, jamesperloff.net. It's called Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 9/11, which goes into great detail about the provocation of the attack, the placement of the fleet at Pearl Harbor, the foreknowledge of the attack through decoded Japanese intercepts, which were not shared with our commanders at Pearl Harbor, and the subsequent cover-up, which was massive. There's so much to be told. And yes, this was another example of the government suppressing the details that could have brought out the truth.
Absolutely. It's it's another tactic they do. They always rinse and reuse the same tactics because they always just so happen to work. And then if people question it, they have the fake news go after them. So there you go. No one can ever question the official narrative because they control the narrative and they control the press.
That's right, and that's been vital to the execution of the plans. And they do like to repeat the same tactics. You know, the Lusitania was sunk in duplication of the sinking of the Maine because they found out that a ship beneath the waters is very impossible to investigate to find out what really happened. But in the case of Pearl Harbor, the public had grown so suspicious they found they needed a whole bunch of Lusitanias to get into America into another world war. But again, that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah.
We should probably talk about after Booth died, and you can ask any questions you want. After Booth died, there was a trial of his 8 alleged co-conspirators. Now, it should be pointed out that these people were denied their constitutional right to a trial by jury. They were tried by a military court, even though they were all civilians. They were treated as if this was a court-martial. And again, this is Stanton making the phony claim that this is an act of war by the Confederacy. By the way, virtually every witness that Stanton produced at the conspiracy trial to say that Jefferson Davis planned this was proven by a House committee subsequently to have been a paid perjurer. And Otto Eisenschmidt has a full 17 pages on these perjurers in his book. I don't go into it as much detail as he does, but this was a 9-man military commission. Most of them had no legal experience. They're all handpicked by Stanton, so the outcome was guaranteed. In a jury trial, you need a unanimous verdict, but in a court-martial, you only need a majority, 5 out of 9, to get a guilty verdict and 6 out of 9 to get the death penalty. I'm sure that Stanton would have loved all 8 to be given the death penalty, but perjury was used throughout the trial against all the unfortunates in this case. It was just absolutely disgusting.
It's
but there's one. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say it's just like the Nuremberg trials. They hired these people to say that, oh, the Germans did this, the Germans did that. Like, oh, the Germans, they're the ones that did the massacre and something forest in Poland that they were trying to blame on the Germans.
Right.
But then Polish patriots came out and said, no, that was the Soviets. And so they were the hook on that one, at least.
Yeah, the Germans wanted the Red Cross to investigate Captain, but Churchill and Roosevelt refused to have the Red Cross go in there and find out who really killed those 15,000 odd Polish officers. Well, this is really significant. At the Lincoln trial, The following evidence was introduced. It was found on John Wilkes Booth's body: his knife, his pistols, his belt, his holster, his file, his compass, spur, tobacco pipe, carbine, cartridges, and bills of exchange from a bank. But 3 items were not introduced. One was his diary. Now, John Wilkes Booth kept a diary, and it was kept concealed for 2 years, even though the chief prosecutor, Joseph Holt, Conger, who brought it, Conger didn't even wait for Booth to die. He brought it from Booth's body straight to Stanton. And before it was given to Stanton, it was flipped through by the head of the Secret Service, Lafayette Baker, Eckert. All the usual suspects knew about this diary. It was kept secret from the trial, and it was kept secret from the public and from the Congress. The only reason we ever found out that John Wilkes Booth held a diary, he kept a diary, was that Stanton had a break with the head of the Secret Service, Lafayette Baker. And Lafayette Baker went rogue and wrote his own book called The History of the Secret Service. And in that book, he wrote about John Wilkes Booth's diary, and he talked about passages in that diary that you won't find today. But this caused a complete outcry in the public, and the Congress that said, John Wilkes Booth kept a diary? And so the chief prosecutor, Joseph Holt, was said, why didn't you introduce the diary at the trial? And Holt said, I didn't think it was relevant. I'm sorry, but I just want to quote what Congressman Benjamin Butler said, because it's well put. Quote, what I want to know is this: it was the good judgment on the part of the gentleman prosecuting the assassins to put in evidence that the tobacco pipe, spur, and compass found in Booth's pocket, why not the diary in his own handwriting and in the same pocket put in evidence? Well, Holt said it wasn't relevant, but it's very, very relevant because it said something very important, even in the pages, the tiny amount of pages that have been given to us today. About 90% of the pages are missing today. And I'll get into this, but the attempted assassin of Secretary of State Seward, Lewis Powell, said there was no plot to murder anyone until 8 o'clock of the day of the assassination. And this is confirmed by George Atzerodt, who allegedly was supposed to assassinate Vice President Johnson. He says there's no plot to murder until 8 o'clock that evening. Now, Booth confirmed this in his diary. He wrote this, quote, April the 14th, until today, nothing was even thought of sacrificing to our country's wrongs. For 6 months, we'd worked to capture, meaning kidnap. But our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. So in other words, there's no plot to murder until the day of the assassination. This meant that certain people convicted at that trial were innocent. For example, Samuel Arnold had been part of the kidnapping plot, which never happened. He broke off with Booth. He hadn't spoken to Booth, had been in Washington for 2 weeks. On the day of the assassination, he was 180 miles away in Fort Monroe, Virginia. He had no way of knowing that an assassination plot had been developed on April the 14th, but he was sentenced to life in prison at hard labor for conspiring to kill President Lincoln. Same thing with Dr. Samuel Mudd, who made that cast for Booth's leg. Wow. There's no way down in his farm in southern Maryland that he knows that in Washington, a plot has developed that day to assassinate the president, but he's given a sentence to life imprisonment. So it was not irrelevant to introduce the diary at the trial. It was totally relevant. And it was even worse than what Congress knew, because pages were torn out of that diary. And I want to again quote Congressman Butler in 1867, quote, that diary is now produced has 18 pages cut out, the pages prior to the time when Abraham Lincoln was massacred, even though the edges show they'd all been written over. Who spoliated that book? Who caused an innocent woman to be hung? Now, 112 years later, 1977, the National Park Service, which had custody of Booth's diary, asked the FBI's forensic laboratory to examine the diary. They did an extensive scientific investigation. Here's what they found. It wasn't 18 pages, it was 86 pages missing. Wow. I'm going to quote the FBI's report, which you can find online. It's also quoted in my book. This is the FBI talking now. Quote, in total, there are 43 full sheets, 86 pages missing from the diary. Why is 43 sheets, 86 pages? Because each sheet has two sides. So 86 pages are missing, and according to the FAA report, this included the 27 pages immediately preceding the assassination of the president on April the 14th. And the FBI said it was, quote, it was noted that many of the remaining edges of the group of 25 missing sheets, there's 25 that they can see, that still have stubs, contain portions of handwriting, which if the remaining pages are later found would assist in any future examination relating to these pages, end quote. So these are not blank pages that Booth himself tore out. He did tear out a couple of blank pages to send a note to a Dr. Richard Stewart. But these 27 pages before the assassination are missing. Not only that, but the FBI found that in the middle of the diary, at the time of the assassination, pages were removed, glued back into the diary selectively. So what you see now is just certain pages. They say these pages were rebound and glued into the diary. As Don Thomas points out, to be rebound into the diary, they first had to be unbound. There's no way that John Wilkes Booth himself took pages out of his diary, took certain pages out, and then rebound and glued certain pages back in. This was very careful work done by an expert, obviously in the War Department. And obviously the people who kept the diary a secret for 2 years, like Holt, Eckert, and Stanton, who kept the diary a total secret, are also the ones, obviously, who are removing these pages, which they don't want the Congress and the American people to know about. So this is pure obstruction of justice, and I'm sorry, any mainstream historian who tries to justify this, you're not an historian.
Exactly. I have 2 questions about that. Is that right?
Sure.
First, did Lee Harvey Oswald have a diary as well?
I don't know that. I haven't studied it. I have to admit, I've read very little about the Kennedy assassination, and just off the top of the head, that doesn't ring a bell for me that he kept a diary. But what information do you have on that?
Oh no, I don't have any. I was just curious because I wanted to ask if you knew if he did, because I honestly don't know. Cause I wanted to bring it up because if he did, that would be something that would come out, because a lot of these people do seem to have diaries. A lot of these lone gunmen. So I was just curious. My second question was Jimmy Carter the one who in charge of this, in charge of revealing giving the order to reveal the diary? He was president at the time.
I believe that it was his Vice President Al Gore who pushed forward for this to be done. He'd been getting some requests. Actually, there were scholars at the time. The reason the FBI investigated it was a couple of reasons. Number one, the diary was falling apart. One reason it was falling apart is because it had been re-glued. It wasn't just the original binding, so it was easily falling apart. And there was concern that in the future, no one would be able to handle it. But the other reason was that certain scholars, mainstream scholars, I should mention, thought that there was secret writing in the diary. Actually, it wasn't secret writing. It was just the pressure of the writing implement creating impressions on the opposite side of the page, which had become dirtied by grease and dirt over time, and it looked like there was secret writing in the diary. The FBI's report showed that there was no secret writing, but the main startling discovery it made was that 86 pages were missing. This included, by the way, several financial transaction pages. I mean, they're specifically labeled as financial transaction pages, ripped out. This would have showed who was paying Booth money and who Booth was paying money to. Very vital to know about, but those pages are gone forever. Unless I don't think they were kept. I don't believe that they were preserved in some secret place. I think after the Congress found out about the diary, they said, let's just destroy them forever. I think they were burned, but
probably.
Yeah,
I feel the same way about those records that Woodrow Wilson held back about the containment of what was on the Lusitania.
Oh yeah, the ship's manifest, right? He ordered that sealed and put in the files of the Treasury Department. He put it in the Treasury Department because the Treasury Department oversee the Customs Office, which was overseeing the goods that went on the Lusitania when it went down. And again, I have a chapter on that in my book, 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, or you can see the story of the Lusitania on my website, jamesperloff.net. It's called False Flag at Sea. It's very extensive, very extensively documented, and I have a link to the original manifest that Wilson kept secret and was finally opened up by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and was found, surprisingly enough, amongst his papers.
Wow, how very interesting. But yes, it isn't. But yeah, of course they're going to burn the diary pages. They don't want anyone getting their hands on that, and they don't want to make the same mistake twice after people seeing the diary and it getting revealed.
So that's one of the things. And another thing I should just mention is that I mentioned how these prisoners were kept in solitary confinement, forbidden to speak to anyone, with hoods over their head. At the trial, they were never allowed to speak in their own defense, never took the witness stand, given defense attorneys at the last second, whereas the prosecution had a whole month to prepare their cases. 4 were hung, so no chance to talk and tell their story. The other 4, they're sentenced to imprisonment or hard labor. You know where they were sent? They were sent to Fort Jefferson on Dry Tortugas. Now, Dry Tortugas is a prison on an island that's west of Key West. They were on an island in the Gulf of Mexico. I didn't know there were islands west of Key West until I read about the Lincoln assassination. And even that wasn't good enough as Stanton. He said, there's a danger that people are going to rescue these prisoners. So I want to make sure that they're not rescued. And how they can be rescued? There's hundreds of armed sentries and hundreds of cannons. There's no way that somebody's going to come up on a sailboat and disarm all these sentries and rescue them. But they were placed in solitary confinement in a dungeon on this island that's west of Key West. How extreme can you get in keeping these people silent? They're deprived of all their rights throughout this whole mess. And again, it goes back to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And today, people who criticize Stanton are said to be guilty of a bizarre conspiracy theory. That's what Edward Steers Jr., who's now the dean of Lincoln Assassination historians, says. But I want to mention, in 1971, NBC television produced a documentary, and you can see it on YouTube. If they take it down, I've got it backed up. It's called It was called They've Killed President Lincoln. It was shown on February the 12th, 1971. It's made by Wolper Productions, major production company, which had made Roots in North and South and a couple hundred other major productions. It was an Emmy-nominated documentary. It was narrated by Richard Basehart, very famous Hollywood actor at that time. It was a very expensive production, and it repeated all the same things that Eisenschimel said. Why was Lincoln lied to about his protection at Ford's Theater? Why did the bodyguard desert his post? Why did the telegraph wires go down? Why didn't Stanton patrol that road? Why was Booth killed? Why did all these key documents, and there are many I haven't even mentioned, disappear from the files? It asked all these questions. This was not a bizarre conspiracy theory. This is NBC television. It was seen by millions of people because there were only 3 networks back then, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And 95% of American homes, more than that, had televisions back then. Then nobody was watching smartphones and PCs because those didn't exist back then. So this was mainstream water cooler conversation that the U.S. government officials were behind the Lincoln assassination. But now it's all been buried, and that's one reason why I wanted to bring out this book, was to restore to the public what had been discovered in the 1930s, 1970s, that indeed Edwin Stanton and the War Department were the key figures behind the assassination of President Lincoln. And no, it was not a Southern plot. It was not. Jefferson Davis was on the run from the Union. He spent 2 years in irons. He had no way to communicate with John Wilkes Booth. The telegraph service was the only service you could have instantly communicated with, and that was under the War Department, under Eckert and Stanton. the South was not guilty of the assassination. It was the radical Republicans and the deep state they represented that wanted to exploit the South and brutalize it after the war. That's why Lincoln was removed, because he opposed that. And people like Eisenschimel and Don Thomas have brought that out, and I wanted to add my voice because this is an episode in American history that people, they need to know the truth about, and not just accept the mainstream narrative as they do about so many other events. And by the way, it's important, I found. You would think it wouldn't be, but it is. The deep state tries to maintain the deep state's narrative of the past, whether it's Pearl Harbor, the Lusitania, Spanish-American War, Civil War. They keep up their own. They honor their Churchills and their Franklin D. Roosevelts and their Woodrow Wilsons, and demean anybody who opposed them at the time. It's sad, but yeah, history, we need it. We need an accurate history. And they maintain the same historical lies, just as they maintain lies today about COVID, climate change, Ukraine, and Gaza.
Yeah, it's very well said. And you know, who controls who controls the fake news is the ones that writes the history books. So you know, you take out your enemies, you can write whatever story you want, and it will get passed down to future generations. Like I said, you know, fake news is just fake history, just fake news passed into the rearview mirror. I got that from a man named Mike King, by the way. A very good, another very good historian, wrote many books. But it's just, I hope that very soon that we can get that maybe some of this stuff can get corrected, possibly. That's what I'm hoping for.
Me too. Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, the Lincoln Assassination, very it's a very deep subject, and I hope that a lot more people look into it as well, and you know, and others as well. Like I feel like that everyone's just too focused on the Kennedy assassination, and not enough on everything else. Like imagine if as much focus was put on the Lincoln assassination as was Kennedy, because even mainstream sources, the truth has sort of come out. It's just that nobody learns about it because it's only shown maybe once on TV or in the back of a newspaper of a mainstream newspaper, and it's just never given legs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, very true. But yeah, like I say, it was on NBC television. It was mainstream at one point. Eisenschimmel's book was a Book of the Month Club selection. They didn't select books that were bizarre conspiracy theories, as now mainstream historians put it. And so I just wanted to challenge those mainstream historians who are making accusations. And by the way, I have a chapter in my book about the mainstream attack on Eisenschimmel and the true narrative, the things he uncovered, the truths he found out about Stanton. The people who try to protect the official mainstream narrative are the same people who are in with melting down the statue of Robert E. Lee, the banning of the Confederate flag. In Richmond today, I don't think I mentioned this, but every Confederate statue has been torn down. The last one to go was of General A.P. Hill. They're destroying history, and part of destroying history is destroying the true history of the Lincoln assassination, which was brought out less than a century ago, but they're now trying to do everything to cover up and refabricate the original fabrications that were made by Stanton's phony, perjured investigation of the Lincoln assassination. I just want to say that Mary Surratt, who was hung, she was the first woman officially executed by the United States. The only proof against her came from two perjured witnesses. One of them, who was hung by his thumbs, is John Lloyd, until they agreed to testify for the prosecution. The other had a rope put around his neck. That's Louis Weichman. And he was told, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't testify for the prosecution. So based on two testimonies that were done under compulsion and threat, she was hung. Her only crime was that she owned a boarding house where sometimes John Wilkes Booth would meet with some of his kidnapping accomplices. But he also met at other places with his kidnapping accomplices, the National Hotel in Washington, taverns. Why weren't the people who owned the taverns and the National Hotel prosecuted? You could do it on the same basis. She was an innocent woman. She was sent to her death. And there's some interesting details about visions that Stanton had of this woman when he was on his deathbed. And that's in the epilogue of my book. And that was reported by one of his closest friends. It was not fake news.
Yeah. I do have to ask, does Stanton, do you have any evidence that that Stanton had ties to Europe?
Not directly. He still had ties to what we call the radical Republicans. And my friend Don Thomas, see if I can find this quickly, on his website, reasonlincoln.com, he's got a chapter called, or a blog post, called "The Capitalists Who Supported Lincoln's Rise and Demanded His Fall." And he lists there the congressmen who were accepting railroad stock in return for their votes. Now, the deep state in America at that time, this isn't extended to Europe really, but the deep state was not really the oil business. John D. Rockefeller eventually became the main force behind the deep state, but the first oil derrick was not erected in America until 1859. During the Civil War, oil was just up and coming. Sorry.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. So I always put cough drops in my mouth when I'm talking, so I go hoarse if I don't. So the deep state consisted of at that time people like Thomas Durant, who Lincoln was an attorney for at one time, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Jay Gould. These were all railroad magnates. It was more the railroads who profited so greatly off the Civil War, and then came to the fore the oil business. But it's interesting, since I wrote my book, it came to my attention that on the morning of the assassination, this is not in my book because I didn't find that out until, but you got to publish a book at some point. John Wilkes Booth met with the future head of B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith is the Freemasonry of Judaism. His name was Simon Wolf. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory because Simon Wolf in his own memoirs said he met with John Wilkes Booth on the morning of the assassination, but he put a very innocent spin on it, so that Booth was depressed and he asked to have a drink with him. But you have to wonder if this had something to do with the plot of the assassination. It turns out that Booth himself was, by the way, I'm half Jewish myself, but Booth was half Jewish. His father, Junius Booth, was actually Jewish. And according to Edwin Booth and Asia Booth, who were John Wilkes Booth's brother and sister, their father, Junius Booth, often went to synagogue, read the Talmud, and met with rabbis. Kind of interesting. But John Wilkes Booth himself, admittedly, he had no overt connection with Freemasonry. He didn't go to synagogue, anything like that. He was nominally an Episcopalian when he was baptized as a baby or a child. But it's just kind of interesting. And you know, in the North, you mentioned August Belmont. He tried to loan money to Lincoln at interest, which Lincoln refused. He was definitely representing the Rothschilds. And then in the South, you have Judah P. Benjamin, who became Secretary of War, Secretary of State, and ran the Confederate Secret Service. Now, it's interesting that Jefferson Davis was put in irons for 2 years after the war. And one of Booth's accomplices named John Surratt was pursued all across Europe, from England to Italy to Malta to Egypt, where he finally brought back to trial in America. But Judah P. Benjamin, nothing happens. He goes to England. He's been the Secretary of War, head of the Confederate Secret. Nothing happens. He becomes a prominent barrister in England. I don't know enough to say this with any proof, but I have to suspect, given the extent of Rothschild power, that the reason that Judah B. Benjamin was never prosecuted was because
he was their agent.
He represented Rothschild interests within the South. I don't know that for a fact, but I would just have to suspect that given the sharp contrast in his being let off the hook, while Surratt, and who again one of Booth's accomplices, and Judah B. Benjamin, who met one time with Surratt, he's let totally off the hook.
Yeah, I'd say you're pretty spot on. A good book I definitely recommend checking out when it comes to these connections is Dixieland Deceived, which was actually just released a few months ago. It's
Really?
Yeah.
I'll write that down. Okay.
It's the best book that I've read on the Civil War, and it talks about all these characters. It talks about the links to back to Europe. It also puts things in context. It mentions a lot of the previous presidents and political figures who I mentioned before, like William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, James Polk, etc., who got, pretty much got the tummy ache and died, essentially. They say, of course, mainstream historians say, they tell you, oh, there was bad water. There was bad water at the White House. But it only got the presidents, right? Oh, Franklin Pierce, his train just so happened to derail over a huge embankment, so the train fell. He survived. He and his wife survived. His son was decapitated. The two, Franklin Pierce and his wife, were pretty much depressed for the rest of their lives. Stuck to the bottle. James Buchanan also had ties to the Rothschilds as well as his vice president. I forget the name, but he was also targeted for with this with the tummy ache, basically, is like I have to call it.
Well, and I should just mention, I referred to Secretary of State Seward when assassination attempt was made upon simultaneously to the Lincoln assassination. I mentioned he'd been in a serious carriage accident. Some people think that carriage accident was not a mistake. When he had that carriage accident, he was actually on his way to warn Lincoln that an assassination was planned against him. So that carriage accident, which almost took his life, that too may not have been an accident. Again, I'm going to engage in speculation, but coincidences do bother me.
Yeah, even if you don't have hard proof of something, at some point you have to sit down and say, okay, the patterns line up, and logical inference basically can tell you things that while you can't go in a courtroom and say, okay, this is a factual printed evidence of it, it's at least worth investigating and going and bringing it to a court and saying, hey, can you please look this up, like going to a detective or something like that, a researcher, because let's see here, 5, 6, 7, 8 prominent political figures, mostly presidents, all dead or almost died in the span of just a couple decades. It seems not suspicious, right? Not suspicious at all. And then, of course, you have the Baltimore plot with Lincoln as well. That's another one.
Right. That's the Knights of the Golden Circle attempting to kill Lincoln. I did go into the possibility that's not proven that Booth may have been a Knight of the Golden Circle. There's see if I have this quote to hand or not. Wait just a moment, if you will. On the morning of the assassination, Booth wrote a letter to his mother. Here's what he said. It was the morning of the assassination. He said, "Dearest mother, I know you expect a letter from me, and I'm sure you'll hardly forgive me, but indeed I have nothing to write about. Everything is dull. That is, has been until last night." He's referring to the Union celebration of the victory over the Confederacy. It was a candlelit parade. "Everything was bright and splendid, more so in my eyes if it had been a display of a nobler cause, but so goes the world, might makes right. Only drop you these few lines to let you know I'm well, to say I have not heard from you. Excuse brevity, I'm in haste. Had one from Rose," that's his sister, "with best love to you all, I'm your affectionate John." Now, nothing in Booth's letter indicated he was planning to embark on a life-changing experience. He's going to kill the president. He's going to be on the run. Something happened that day, and we know that he co-signed a letter with 5 other men. It's supposed to be delivered to the National Intelligencer, which was a Washington newspaper. That letter was never delivered, and Booth probably revealed the names of those 5 men in his diary on the missing pages. He kept that diary for his own protection, but because he was shot, killed, and the diary was confiscated, it was never revealed. But something happened that day, and I believe that he was probably ordered to kill Lincoln by the Knights of the Golden Circle. But these would not be true knights. These would be feds who have infiltrated the knights just as they did in the 1861 plot. They foiled that plot by infiltrating the knights and then told Booth, the South wants Lincoln dead. You're assigned to kill Seward and Lincoln. We'll take care of the rest. We'll take care of Grant, Stanton, and the rest. But what Booth didn't know was it was only him that was going to commit assassinations that day. And when he went south, he waited at a place called Soper's Hill in Maryland. The other so-called assassins never showed up. And in what we have left of his diary, he said the failure of the mission was due to others who did not strike. He's talking about the other 5 men. They never planned to strike. It was just Booth. He was suckered. He was double-crossed and made the patsy to kill Lincoln and Seward while the other assassinations didn't take place. I can't prove that, but based on the collective circumstantial evidence, it all points to that. When you're a member of a secret society like the Knights of the Golden Circle of Freemasons or Skull and Bones, if you receive an order, you have to follow it. And Booth probably would have said, listen, I can't shoot President Lincoln and never get away with it. They would have told him, well, don't worry, the bodyguard will be gone. The telegraph wires are going to be shut down. You have a free pass to get over the bridge. You'll be treated as a hero in the South. Don't worry, Mr. Booth. Everything is taken care of. We're taking care of it from the top. But what he didn't realize was he was really working for the Union, not thinking he was working for the South. He was really working for the South. And the ultimate thing that he was told to do was when he jumped on that stage was to say, the South is avenged, and shout the state motto of Virginia. I think he was told to say that because that's exactly what Stanton wanted. He wanted this Confederacy to be blamed for the assassination. And the best way to do that is in front of 1,500 witnesses at Ford's Theater. Say the South is behind us. This was exactly the way Stanton would have scripted it from beginning to end.
Yep, and on top of that, that answers the question of how Booth knew that he would be able to get across the bridge so easily.
Right.
Because he had to have absolute certainty. Otherwise, he was going to get lynched.
Right. He would not have done that assassination. I made this point in my book. People will be more likely to commit violent acts if they think they're part of a mob. During a mob, people lose control. Booth thought he was part of a mob. There was going to be a whole bunch of assassinations. And he stayed with his broken leg. He stayed in a pine thicket, and every day he would read the newspapers that were brought to him, waiting to see news of the letter co-signed by 5 of the men published. It wasn't published. Waiting to hear news that the rest of the cabinet had been assassinated. They weren't. It was just him. It was just him, and he was all alone now with Union troops in pursuit.
And I'm betting that, and this is my personal thought, I believe that if Booth didn't break his leg and managed to get away, he probably would have fled to Europe just like Judah Benjamin did. And he probably would have lived a nice, happy life.
I do quote a book. I probably don't have it within reach here. There's a book written in 1908 by a man who, sorry, I'm stretching to remember his name now. Smoot had sold a boat to John Surratt, one of Booth's co-conspirators in the kidnapping plot. It was a strong boat, could hold maybe 15 men. And in Smoot's own memoirs, he said he believed that boat, the intention was to use it to kidnap Lincoln. And the boat was kept on a creek off of the Potomac River. And it was his belief that Booth's intention was to ride for that boat. That was the original intention. Get on the boat, go to the seashore, get on board a foreign steamer, and go to a country that had no extradition treaty with the United States. Now you might think, well, how could John Wilkes Booth disguise himself? Well, when he was at Dr. Mudd, he shaved off his mustache. He had fake whiskers, and as an actor, he was an expert at playing old men. He could have hobbled aboard a foreign ship, pretended to be somebody else, and got into a foreign country. That probably was his original plan, but that broken leg killed everything for him. From that broken leg on, he had to improvise, but he couldn't improvise himself past all those thousands of detectives and soldiers who are now looking for him in Virginia.
I believe that was God's way of showing karma, because it was the American flag that he ended up breaking his leg on.
Yeah, that was a tremendous irony. And it was the one thing that neither Booth nor Stanton was counting on, was he would break his leg like that.
Oh man, but yeah, 3 books I would definitely recommend reading on the Civil War and regarding the things I mentioned, pertaining to Lincoln and such. Not just the assassination itself, because that's what you covered, but moreover, the broad spectrum is Planet Rothschild. There's 2 volumes. There's 1 and 2. The first one goes up because it covers the start of America, right from the very start of its founding, all the way up until like 2015, I believe, is when the book was written. And then the other book is called Dixieland Deceived, which oh my goodness, there's a lot of stuff. I could wait. Are you okay with reading digital? With reading things digitally?
Oh, sure. I do that all the time. Yeah, Kindle books, etc.
Oh, okay. In that case, I could probably send you. A copy. That I'd have to ask the writer's permission first, because I don't want to be.
Well, if this book is talking about Dixieland Deceived.
Yeah, Dixieland.
I could always buy that if it's available on Amazon. I wouldn't mind paying for a copy.
Oh yeah, it's available on Amazon. As well as the other book I mentioned called Planet Rothschild. Like I said, 2 volumes on that. But the main one is Dixieland Deceived. That's the main one on the Civil War. Oh my goodness, it's just absolutely crazy. If Lincoln had lived, in my opinion, I feel like that the country would have been a lot better off, because even after Lincoln passed away, even after Lincoln was murdered, we pretty much had a Republican dynasty going from Lincoln all the way through Herbert Hoover. The only 2 people that slipped in was Grover Cleveland. He only just made it because the Republican he was up against was the vice president under Garfield, and he didn't want to. I think it was Chester Arthur. He didn't want to. He wasn't intentional on running. And then the other one, of course, was Woodrow Wilson, who was, of course, put there because Bernard Baruch and Jacob Schiff and them split the Republican votes to kick out William Howard Taft. And then they had to kill the Republican dynasty with the Federal Reserve by issuing the stock market crash, blaming it on Hoover. Whenever they want a president out of there, they always kill the stock market, and then they blame it on the president because people don't know how the economy works. And if they want a president in there, they make the economy look super good, like Obama, for example.
Right.
It's just, but I am getting a bit off topic. Was there anything else you wanted to mention about the Lincoln assassination before we wrap up?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. I think there's still unanswered questions about it, but I've tried to bring the main points that are known forward, that people could be aware of them. Things that were once, like I say, common conversation amongst Americans less than a century ago that have been forgotten about.
Yep, especially in today's news climate, where yesterday's big story is, that's what it is, yesterday's big story. We got to move on to today's big story, because people's attention span these days is just too short, unfortunately. It's like even 9/11, people don't care about 9/11 no more. They're moving on.
That's a shame. Yeah, that's a shame. I was working on a book on 9/11 when COVID hit, and then maybe I shouldn't mention that word, but you can delete that if you want.
It's fine. Go ahead. This isn't going to be on YouTube anyway. Just
okay. All right. Yeah. But I had to stop that book on 9/11, which I'd spent about 6 to 8 months on, because more pressing issues had arrived, and they continue to arrive, unfortunately. So I never did finish the book on 9/11, but I'd wanted to examine 9/11 from a very forensic, very evidence-based approach. I'd been a little too speculative to my blog post about 9/11, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't speculate. I wanted this has to be evidence I could bring to court. That was my attitude in writing the book, but never got to finish it.
If you'd like, because the anniversary is coming up of 9/11 in a few weeks, if you'd like, we could do a show going over some of the stuff that you were planning to include in your book that you never got the chance to finish. Which, by the way, now that you finished with the Lincoln book, I wanted to ask you if it was possible you could go back and finish that 9/11 book, because I'd really like to see that.
No, I don't think I will. I think too many things are happening in our world between the illegal immigration, the potential of a third world war. I don't think I'm going to go back to that. I don't think the book would even do well, even if I hit it on the money. I don't think it would do that well. So I'll continue to work on other things. But who knows? Maybe I'll write a blog post summarizing a few things about 9/11. We'll see.
Would you be okay with doing a show on the topic since the anniversary is coming up?
Maybe not, because I'm committed to speak to a group on September the 19th about another topic, and another group in October, and still have some shows on the Lincoln Assassination schedule. So I don't think I would have a time, but I will. I know this on September the 11th. I always post about 100 tweets that are relevant to 9/11. I'll put that on Gab and on Twitter. There's a whole bunch of things about predictive programming and anomalies in the 9/11 story. I try to bring that. I've done that every year for a few years now, but I don't think I'd have time to prep for a show on it. I think that'd be more challenging. Yeah.
I understand. You're a very busy man, so I'm. Oh my goodness, you put a lot of work on yourself, and I'm very appreciative of that. But don't work yourself too hard, okay?
Oh, well, that's always good advice. That's always good advice. I'll take that. Good.
All right. Well, one more thing I wanted to mention before we wrap up. I did want to say that you were mentioning about World War III. I am actually of the opinion that that I'm sitting here and not even worrying about it, because after doing some research into because I have a lot of free time, so I do a lot of research. And I've come to the conclusion that there really is no need to worry about a World War III, and that this is all just theater. If you want to, I don't want to get into why, because that's like a whole another video in and of itself. I definitely think that as grim as things may look on the surface, I truly believe that behind the scenes, if you look beneath the surface, things are actually working out better than they ever have been, and I say that with confidence, because.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that things are working out better, but I do believe you might be right about that World War III could be hype. From my own viewpoint, if they're planning to start a third world war, I don't know why they're building, for example, all this 5G infrastructure, which a world war with nuclear weapons would wipe out, most likely. It seems to contradict their own plannings. So there's arguments that could be brought, certainly, against the possibility of a third world war. Although, as we record this, Netanyahu's bombing of Lebanon, Syria, and Iran, to say nothing of Gaza, and Ukraine trying to push the war into Russia proper, seem to be, they're trying to tempt other nations into a third world war. I really don't know. I don't know what the future holds, but I think arguments could be made either way.
Yeah. It's just, this is just my opinion, and I personally think the Israeli dog is finally been put down. I don't think we're ever going to be fighting another war for Israel ever again. I think it's done.
Hope you're right. Hope you're right.
Yeah.
It should have been happened long ago.
Oh, absolutely. And the USS Liberty.
Yeah.
All right, but thanks for tuning in, everyone. I appreciate it. Go to James's website, www.jamesperloff.net. That's all his books are on there, as well as all his articles. He has very, very good articles, and some of them are long, but they're very much worth reading. And my personal favorite, if I had to say my personal favorite, it would definitely have to be Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 9/11. That, because I don't know about anyone else what they'd say, but I personally think you are the #1 expert in Pearl Harbor in the world today.
Well, when I first wrote on Pearl Harbor was 1986. Cover story for the New American Magazine, so that goes back almost 40 years. So I have to spend a lot of time on that, and time has simply tended to validate the revelations, the whistleblowing that had been done from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. But all right, like I said, thanks again for everyone
Thank you.
for checking in, and thank you, James, for coming on. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you very much, Taylor. Thank you for being on. This is a long conversation, but we managed to cover not only the Lincoln assassination, but a lot of collateral topics.
Yes. All right. Well, I'll see you all later, everyone. Take care and tune in again, please, and like, subscribe, and all that stuff. I can't even say that with a straight face because too many people say it, but helps the algorithm, I guess. Anyway, see you later, everybody.